What if the worst thing ever said about you became the very sentence that rewrote your life? They did not shout it. They did not announce it from a podium. They whispered it, carefully, politely, almost kindly. But whispers travel faster than truth, and by the time it reached her ears, it no longer sounded like gossip. It sounded like a verdict. Unworthy. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just final. She first noticed it in the way conversations stopped when she entered a room, the way older women tilted their heads with sympathy that felt more like inspection, the way men avoided meeting her eyes as if eye contact alone might create obligation. It was subtle, respectable, civil, and that was what made it unbearable, because no one had accused her of wrongdoing. She had committed no crime, broken no vow, shamed no name. She simply did not fit. In a town where daughters were measured by charm and silence, she possessed too much thought in her eyes. Where softness was praised, she carried quiet strength. Where obedience passed for virtue, she asked questions. And questions in a world built on fragile traditions are dangerous things. At first, she laughed off the rumors. She told herself people were bored, that someone else would soon become the subject of their curiosity. But days passed, then weeks, and the looks did not fade. Suitors who once visited her father's home stopped coming. Invitations grew scarce. The music at gatherings seemed to play around her rather than with her. She remained present, but no longer included. It is a strange feeling to realize your future has been quietly withdrawn. She began to feel it most in the evenings, when the house settled into silence, when lamps dimmed and the air felt heavy with things unsaid. She would sit by the window and watch the road, wondering which version of herself had offended the world. Was she too proud, too thoughtful, too different? The human heart has a dangerous habit. It searches for flaws when rejected. It assumes guilt where none exists. And slowly, without realizing it, she began to doubt herself. Her father noticed the change before anyone else did. He saw the way her laughter shortened, the way she folded into herself at dinner, the way she no longer lingered outside when neighbors passed by. She tried to hide it, but fathers recognized the quiet sorrows their daughters refused to speak aloud. At first, he dismissed the rumors as cruelty, small-minded talk from people who envied what they did not understand. He had raised her to think, to read, to speak clearly. He had once been proud of her independence, but pride does not stand unshaken against public judgment. The whispers grew sharper, more confident, no longer speculative, but decisive. She is difficult. She is not suitable. And in a society where marriage was not just romance but survival, reputation meant everything. Men he respected began offering advice disguised as concern. They spoke of timing, of opportunity, of risk. They reminded him that daughters did not remain young forever, that chances once lost did not return. They did not accuse him of failure. They simply planted doubt. And doubt, when repeated often enough, becomes fear. He began to lie awake at night, replaying conversations in his mind. What if they were right? What if her spirit, the very thing he once admired, was the reason doors were closing? What if the world was not wrong? Fear does not announce itself as fear. It disguises itself as practicality, responsibility, protection. He convinced himself he was thinking ahead, that he was preparing for reality she did not yet understand, that fathers must sometimes make difficult choices for the sake of their children's future. But beneath all of that logic lived something far more fragile. He was afraid of watching her be rejected again, afraid of seeing hope drain from her eyes one suitor at a time, afraid that if he did nothing, the world would eventually break her. And so, he began to consider doing something. The shift was subtle at first. Conversations became shorter. He asked more questions about her interests, not out of curiosity but calculation. He observed her not as a daughter but as a problem to be solved. She felt it. Children always do. There was no single moment when she realized he was changing. It was gradual, a slight tightening in his voice, a carefulness in his words, a distance that did not exist before. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and shadows stretched across the floor, he asked her to sit with him. There was no anger in his face, no disappointment, only exhaustion. He spoke gently about reputation, about safety, about the realities of the world. He did not repeat the cruel words others had used. He softened them, reframed them, presented them as unfortunate misunderstandings. but the meaning remained the same. He told her that sometimes life required adjustments, that perhaps her path would not look like others, that he had made a decision. The air left her lungs before she realized she had stopped breathing. She did not cry. She did not argue. That was what unsettled him most. She simply listened, because deep down she had already sensed this was coming. When the world labels you long enough, you begin to expect confirmation. His decision was meant to shield her, to remove her from scrutiny, to place her in circumstances where whispers could no longer reach. But protection, when imposed without consent, feels a lot like exile. That night she returned to her room and sat in the dark, not because she preferred darkness, but because it felt honest. The light would have required pretending. She replayed every memory she could find, searching for the moment she had become unworthy. She found none. And that was the cruelest part. There was no failure to correct, no apology to offer, no mistake to undo. She had been judged not for what she did, but for who she was. Outside, the town continued as usual. Lamps glowed behind windows. Laughter drifted through the streets. No one realized that inside one home, a future had quietly shifted direction. The next morning, everything looked the same, but nothing was. Word of her father's decision spread quickly. It was praised as wise, responsible, sensible. People nodded approvingly. They admired his foresight. And just like that, the whispers stopped, not because they were proven wrong, but because she had been removed from their reach. Silence returned to the town. But inside her, something else had awakened. At first, it was grief, heavy and suffocating. The mourning of a life she once imagined, of children she might never hold, of partnerships she might never experience, of belonging she might never feel. But beneath the grief, something steadier began to form. Clarity. When you are stripped of expectation, you are forced to confront yourself without distraction. She began to ask different questions. If marriage no longer defined her future, what did? If approval was no longer attainable, why chase it? If society had already decided her worth, why continue trying to convince it otherwise? These thoughts did not arrive triumphantly. They arrived quietly, cautiously, like seeds unsure whether the soil would accept them. Her father watched from a distance, uncertain whether he had saved her or silenced her. He expected resentment. Instead, he received politeness. He expected defiance. Instead, he received calm. But calm can be misleading, because while the world believed her story had ended, it had only begun shifting direction. She started reading again, writing again, walking alone without lowering her gaze. The absence of expectation felt unfamiliar, but freeing. No suitors to impress, no image to maintain, no performance required. The label that once felt suffocating slowly lost its weight. Unworthy of marriage, but not unworthy of life, not unworthy of thought, not unworthy of meaning. Her father began to sense something changing, something he had not anticipated. He had intended to protect her from humiliation. Instead, he had removed her from confinement. Because once a person is no longer trying to fit into a system that rejected them, they begin to see that system clearly. And clarity is powerful. He started to question himself. Had he acted out of love or fear? Had he saved her or reshaped her into someone distant? He noticed the way she no longer sought his approval, the way her confidence returned, not loud but steady, the way she carried herself without apology. She was not broken. She was becoming something else, stronger, self-defined, independent in a way that did not require permission. And for the first time, he understood something that unsettled him deeply. The world had not diminished her. It had underestimated her. His decision had changed her fate forever. That part was undeniable. But fate, he was beginning to realize, is not the same as ruin. Sometimes the sentence meant to confine you becomes the moment you step outside the cage. Sometimes being declared unworthy frees you from the burden of proving yourself. And sometimes the quietest judgments create the loudest transformations. The town would never fully understand what they had set in motion. They would remember the story as a cautionary tale, a father protecting his daughter, a sensible decision made in difficult times. They would never see the nights she spent rebuilding herself. They would never hear the thoughts that strengthened her resolve. They would never know that the girl they labeled unworthy had quietly outgrown their definition of worth. Because the truth is this: judgment can redirect a life, Fear can rewrite a future, but neither can erase a person's essence. And in the silence that followed society's verdict, she began writing her own, not as someone cast aside, not as someone rescued, but as someone awakened, and the most powerful transformations rarely begin with applause. They begin with rejection, with a whisper, with a single word spoken softly enough to wound. Unworthy. The world believed that word would shrink her. It had no idea it was about to make her limitless. He told himself that time would make everything easier. That distance would soften the memory of the decision. That silence would eventually turn into acceptance. After all, people forget. Community move on. Scandals fade. And life, no matter how heavy it feels in the moment, always continues forward. At least, that was what he believed in the beginning. The house grew quieter first, not suddenly but slowly, the way warmth leaves a room when a window is left open too long. Conversations became shorter. Meals passed without laughter. The familiar rhythm of their lives changed into something careful, almost rehearsed. Nothing was openly wrong, yet nothing felt the same. He watched her closely, searching for signs that he had done the right thing. He expected anger, resistance, perhaps even rebellion. Instead, she became calm, respectful, composed in a way that unsettled him more than defiance ever could, because calm did not mean peace. It meant distance. She no longer argued, no longer tried to explain herself. The questions that once filled her voice disappeared, replaced by quiet acceptance. And in that silence he began to feel something he had not anticipated: doubt. At first, it came gently, a passing thought late at night, a question he quickly pushed away. Had there been another way? Had he acted too quickly? But every time uncertainty appeared, he reminded himself why he had done it. He had protected her. That was what fathers were supposed to do. The world was harsh, judgment was unforgiving. He had only stepped in before it could hurt her further. He repeated this reasoning so often that it almost sounded true. Almost. But time has a way of revealing the cost of decisions, not through dramatic consequences, but through small changes that slowly become impossible to ignore. She began to change, not into someone broken, as he once feared, but into someone self-contained, independent. She no longer looked to him for direction, no longer waited for approval. Her life moved forward quietly, without asking permission. And instead of relief, he felt something closer to loss. He realized that in trying to protect her from the world, he had unknowingly pushed her away from him. There were moments when he caught glimpses of the daughter he remembered, a brief smile, a thoughtful question, a softness that surfaced without warning. But those moments passed quickly, replaced by the steady composure she now carried like armor. She had learned to rely on herself, and that realization unsettled him more than any public criticism ever had. The town, meanwhile, had already forgotten the whispers that once felt unbearable disappeared entirely. New stories replaced old ones. New subjects captured attention. The judgment that had seemed so permanent proved to be temporary after all. That was when regret truly began. All the fear, all the worry, the decision that changed everything, and the world had moved on as if it never mattered. He started noticing the irony. The very society he tried to satisfy no longer cared. The reputation he fought to protect was never truly in danger. The sacrifice had been real, but the threat had not. And that truth was difficult to face, because it meant the pain she carried had not been necessary. He began to see her strength differently. What he once viewed as stubbornness now looked like resilience. What he once feared would isolate her had in fact allowed her to survive without dependence on anyone's approval. She was not waiting for life to begin anymore. She was already living it. Their conversations changed over time. Less instruction, more listening. He found himself choosing words carefully, aware that authority no longer held the same meaning between them. Respect remained, but it had transformed into something quieter, more equal, and with that change came understanding. Love, he realized, is not proven through control. It is proven through trust, through allowing someone to become who they are even when that path feels uncertain. He had mistaken fear for responsibility, and now he lived with the consequences of that mistake. Yet life, in its quiet mercy, does not always deny second chances. Healing did not arrive through grand apologies or emotional confrontations. It arrived in small moments, shared silence that no longer felt uncomfortable, conversations that lasted a little longer than before, a gradual rebuilding of something fragile but real. He understood that he could not undo the past. The decision had already shaped her life. It had changed her path in ways neither of them could reverse. But he also began to see something unexpected. She was not defined by that moment anymore. The label that once threatened her future no longer held power. She had outgrown it. The world's judgment had faded, but the strength she gained remained. And in that realization, he found both comfort and sorrow. Comfort because she had survived, sorrow because she had learned to do so without needing him. In the end, he understood a truth that arrives too late for many people. The hardest part of love is knowing when to step back, when to accept that protection can become limitation, and that fear, no matter how well-intentioned, can change lives in ways we never intended. His decision had changed her fate forever, but not by ending her future, by forcing her to create one on her own. And as he watched her walk forward, steady, confident, no longer defined by the world's expectations, he realized that the daughter he tried to save had become stronger than the world that once judged her. The whispers were gone, the judgment forgotten. But the lesson remained. Sometimes the choices we make to protect the people we love become the very challenges that teach them who they truly are. And sometimes the greatest regret is not the mistake itself, but understanding it only after the person you feared losing has already learned to live without your protection. She did not realize the moment she stopped waiting for permission. There was no single turning point, no dramatic declaration, no sudden burst of courage. Change arrived quietly, almost unnoticed, the way dawn replaces darkness without asking anyone's approval. One day, she simply woke up and understood that the life she had been mourning no longer existed, and neither did the version of herself that once depended on it. For a long time after her father's decision, she lived as though time had paused. Days felt repetitive, heavy with thoughts she could not escape. She replayed conversations in her mind, searching for meaning, for explanation, for some hidden mistake she could correct. It is human nature to believe rejection must have a reason, that pain must be earned. But the more she searched, the clearer one truth became. There had been no failure, only judgment. And judgment, she slowly realized, says more about those who give it than those who receive it. At first, this realization frightened her, because if the world had been wrong, then she had spent months shrinking herself for no reason. She had doubted her voice, her thoughts, her worth, all to fit expectations that were never truly hers. That understanding hurt more than the rejection itself. Yet pain has a strange ability to sharpen clarity. Without the constant pressure to prove herself acceptable, she began to notice things she had never seen before. The quiet freedom of solitude, the absence of comparison, the relief of no longer performing for approval. She started walking alone in the mornings, when the streets were empty and the air felt honest, no curious eyes, no whispered assumptions, just silence and the sound of her own footsteps. At first, the silence felt lonely. Then, slowly, it became peaceful. She began reading again, writing again, thinking without immediately questioning whether her thoughts were appropriate or desirable. The world that once felt closed to her revealed new spaces she had never considered. For the first time, she was not trying to become what others expected. She was discovering who she already was. Meanwhile, her father watched this transformation from a distance he did not know how to cross. He had expected sadness to fade into dependence. She no longer seemed lost. She seemed certain. And certainty can be unsettling when it grows without you. He noticed how she carried herself differently. Not proudly, not defiantly, but calmly, as if the need for validation had quietly disappeared. She spoke less, but when she did, her words carried weight. She no longer sought agreement. She simply expressed herself and moved on. It made him uneasy in ways he struggled to explain, because somewhere deep inside, he realized she had learned something he had not. She had learned how to live without fear of judgment. He, on the other hand, had built his decision entirely around it. The town that once felt suffocating continued its routines without noticing the change. New families arrived. Old rumors faded. The same people who once whispered about her now greeted her politely, as though nothing had ever happened. That, more than anything, revealed the truth. The judgment that altered her life had never been permanent. It had only felt that way in the moment. Society moves quickly. It forgets easily, but the consequences of its judgments remain with those who experience them. She understood this now, and instead of bitterness, she felt something unexpected: detachment. The opinions that once wounded her now felt distant, almost irrelevant. She no longer needed to correct them. She no longer needed to defend herself. The were. LD could think what it wanted. Her life no longer depended on its approval. This shift did not make her cold. It made her steady, compassionate in a quieter way. She began to notice how many people around her lived in quiet fear of being misunderstood. How many shaped their lives around expectations they never questioned. She recognized that fear because she had lived inside it, and surviving it changed her. Her father sensed the distance growing even as peace seemed to return to their home. Conversations became easier but less personal. Respect replaced intimacy. He realized with uncomfortable clarity that she no longer needed his guidance in the way she once had. He had wanted to protect her future. Instead, he had accelerated her independence. There were nights he sat alone, replaying the past, wondering when concern had turned into control, when love had become fear. He remembered the pressure, the advice, the warnings from others. At the time, their words had felt urgent, undeniable. Now they felt small, because none of those people lived with the consequences. He did. He began to see that strength often grows in silence, far away from the eyes that once judged it. She had rebuilt herself without recognition, without reassurance, and that realization filled him with both pride and regret. Pride because she had endured, regret because she had needed to. Their relationship changed slowly, shaped by unspoken understanding. He stopped trying to explain his decision. She stopped trying to understand it. Some things they both realized could not be undone by explanation alone. Healing came instead through presence, shared moments without tension, small conversations that no longer carried expectation. It was not the same closeness they once shared, but it was honest, and honesty, though quieter than love, lasts longer. As months turned years, her story transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The label that once defined her lost meaning entirely. People remembered fragments, then nothing at all. Life continued, indifferent to past judgments. But she remembered, not as a wound, but as a lesson. She understood now that worth is rarely recognized at the right time, that society often fears what it cannot easily categorize, and that being rejected by one path does not mean losing all paths. Sometimes it means discovering a better one. She no longer saw herself as someone who had been denied a future. She saw herself as someone forced to create one intentionally. Every choice she made now belonged to her alone, not to expectation, not to tradition, not to fear. And that ownership brought a quiet kind of happiness, not loud joy, not dramatic triumph, just peace. Her father noticed it one evening as they sat together in silence, watching the sun disappear beyond the horizon. There was no tension between them, only stillness. For the first time in years, he realized she was not carrying resentment. She had moved beyond it. That realization brought relief and sorrow, because it meant she had grown through something he had caused. He finally understood that fate is not always shaped by intention. Sometimes the decisions meant to limit someone become the very experiences that expand them. Pain, when survived, changes perspective. It removes what truly matters. His decision had changed her fate forever. But not by ending her possibilities, by forcing her to define them herself, and as he watched her step into a life shaped by her own choices, he realized something both humbling and profound. The daughter he once feared the world would reject had become someone who no longer feared the world at all. The whispers were gone, the judgment forgotten, but the transformation remained, because in the end, she was never unworthy. She had simply been ahead of the expectations placed upon her. And sometimes, the people who do not fit the world as it is are the ones who quietly learn how to live beyond it. Her story did not end with rejection. It began there, and what once felt like loss became the moment she stopped asking who she was supposed to be, and finally became who she truly was. By the time anyone noticed the change, it had already happened. There was no announcement, no dramatic turning point that marked the moment she became different. Transformation rarely looks impressive from the outside. It happens quietly, through small choices repeated over time, through wounds that slowly stop bleeding and begin to heal into something stronger. The girl who once waited for approval no longer existed. In her place stood someone calmer, steadier, someone who understood that life does not always unfold according to expectation, and that survival itself can become a kind of strength. At first, people assumed she had simply accepted her circumstances, that she had settled into the life chosen for her. It was an easy conclusion, one that allowed others to feel comfortable again. After all, acceptance is less threatening than change. But what they failed to see was that acceptance and surrender are not the same thing. She had not surrendered. She had adapted. The loneliness that once felt unbearable had slowly turned into space to think, to observe, to understand herself without interruption. Without the constant pressure of being evaluated, she discovered parts of her personality that had long been hidden beneath expectation. She realized how much of her life had been shaped by the fear of disappointing others. How often she had softened her opinions, quieted her voice, adjusted herself to fit situations that never truly felt natural. The rejectio, end that once seemed like an ending, began to look different. It had removed her from a role she was never meant to play. This realization did not come with bitterness. Surprisingly, it came with relief. For the first time, her worth was no longer being measured by someone else's standards. She was free to define it herself. And that freedom changed everything. She began to move through life with quiet confidence. Not the loud kind that demands attention, but the steady kind that no longer seeks permission. People noticed it, even if they could not explain it. Conversations with her felt different now. She listened more, spoke less, and when she did speak, her words carried certainty. There was no longer a need to prove anything. Her father noticed it most of all. At first, he mistook her calmness for distance, and perhaps part of it was. The closeness they once shared had changed, reshaped by time and experience. But beneath that distance, something new had formed, mutual understanding. He began to see her not as someone fragile, but as someone capable. The realization filled him with pride, yet also with quiet regret. He understood now that the strength he admired had grown from hardship he helped create. It was a difficult truth to carry. There were moments when he wanted to apologize, to explain the fear that had guided his decision, but explanations felt inadequate. Some choices cannot be undone with words. They can only be acknowledged through change. So instead, he listened. He allowed her space, allowed her independence, and slowly, without either of them saying it aloud, their relationship began to heal in a different form. Less authority, more respect. Less protection, more trust. The world outside continued as it always had, indifferent to personal transformations. The same streets, the same conversations, the same people chasing approval and fearing judgment. But she no longer felt trapped within that cycle. She had seen what happened when life was built entirely around expectation. And she no longer wished to live that way. What once felt like loss now looked like redirection. The future she had imagined was gone, yes, but in its place stood something more honest, a life shaped by choice rather than obligation, a path defined not by acceptance but by authenticity. She understood now that being different was never the problem. The problem had been trying to hide it. That understanding brought peace, not perfect happiness. Life rarely offers that, but a steady sense of belonging within herself. The need for validation faded. The fear of judgment lost its power. She no longer measured her life against others. She simply lived it. Her father watched this quiet transformation with growing clarity. He realized that the world he had tried so hard to protect her from had never truly been the danger. The real danger had been fear itself, fear of opinion, fear of uncertainty, fear of allowing someone to walk their own path. He had acted out of love, but love shaped by fear can still cause harm. And yet, as he saw her moving forward with confidence, he also understood something unexpected. His decision, though painful, had forced both of them to confront truths they might never have faced otherwise. She learned independence. He learned humility. Neither lesson came easily, but both changed them. One evening, as they sat together in comfortable silence, he noticed something he had not seen in a long time: ease. She was no longer carrying the weight of what others thought of her. The tension that once surrounded her had disappeared. She looked free, and in that moment he finally understood that fate does not always arrive as we expect. Sometimes it comes disguised as disappointment. Sometimes it feels like loss before revealing its purpose. His decision had changed her fate forever, but it had not diminished her life. It had revealed her strength. The girl once declared unworthy had become someone defined not by rejection, but by resilience, someone who no longer needed the world's approval to feel complete. And perhaps that was the quiet irony of it all. The very moment meant to limit her had become the moment she discovered her own power. Because in the end, transformation is rarely loud. It does not demand recognition. It simply happens, slowly, patiently, until one day you realize you are no longer the person the world once judged. You are someone stronger, someone free. Sometimes the end of a story does not feel like an ending at all. It feels like silence after a long storm, the kind of silence where everything looks the same, yet nothing truly is. By the time her journey reached this point, the world had already moved on. The whispers had faded, the judgments forgotten, and the people who once spoke with certainty could no longer even remember why her name had mattered. But for her, the meaning of everything had changed. She no longer carried the weight of proving herself. The struggle that once defined her had slowly transformed into understanding. She realized that the hardest battles are rarely fought against other people. They are fought within, against doubt, against fear, against the quiet voice that asks whether you are enough. For a long time, she believed her life had been redirected by someone else's decision, that her future had been taken from her before she could choose it herself, and in many ways that was true. But with time came a realization far more powerful than resentment. What happened to her did not define her. What she became afterward did. She learned that rejection can either shrink a person or sharpen them, that pain can close a heart or open it, and that sometimes the path we resist the most becomes the one that teaches us who we really are. The girl once described as unworthy no longer existed. In her place stood someone who understood her own value without needing confirmation, someone who had walked through loneliness and discovered strength instead of bitterness, someone who no longer feared being misunderstood, and that quiet confidence changed the way people saw her, not because she demanded attention, but because she no longer needed it. Her father saw it too, the change that time had carved into both of them. He understood now that love is not measured by control or protection, but by the courage to let someone grow, even when that growth leads them beyond your reach. Their relationship never returned to what it once was. Some distances, once created, remain, but in their place grew something more honest, respect without expectation, care without fear, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had both learned. And perhaps that was the real ending of their story. Not tragedy, not victory, understanding. Because life rarely offers perfect resolutions. Instead, it offers perspective, the chance to look back and realize that the moments which felt like endings were often beginnings in disguise. Her fate had changed forever, yes, but not in the way anyone expected. She had not disappeared. She had not been broken. She had simply stepped outside the narrow definition the world had written for her. And once outside it, she discovered something many people never do: the freedom to define her own worth. That is why stories like hers matter, because somewhere, someone listening right now knows this feeling. The feeling of being judged too quickly, of being misunderstood, of being told directly or indirectly that they are not enough. And if that person is listening, then this story is not just hers anymore. It is yours too. Maybe you have been overlooked. Maybe someone else decided what your future should look like. Maybe you are standing in a moment that feels like rejection, wondering if everything you hoped for is slipping away. But here is the truth most people learn too late. The moment you stop chasing approval is the moment your real life begins. The world will always have opinions. It will always try to place people into categories it understands. But your worth has never depended on fitting those expectations. It depends on what you choose to become after the judgment fades. So if this story meant something to you, do not let it end here. Take a moment right now and ask yourself, what label have you been carrying that no longer belongs to you? And more importantly, what would happen if you finally let it go? If this journey moved you, if you felt even a small part of your own story inside it, then stay connected. Share your thoughts below. Tell us where you are watching from and what part of the story stayed with you the most. Stories grow stronger when voices are shared, and someone reading your words might find the courage they need today. And if you believe more stories like this deserve to be told, stories about resilience, quiet strength, and the moments that change us forever, make sure you support the channel, stay with us, and be part of the next journey. Because sometimes the stories that begin with rejection end with awakening. And sometimes, the person the world once underestimated becomes the one who finally understands their own power.